podium. All right, so today I wanted to talk about something that I feel is often sugar-coated or looked over in today's churches, especially in churches in the West. It's everything that Christ went through, from the garden to the cross. This is a forewarning. There will be graphic content. There will be medical depictions. There will be there will be a graphic painting that a painter did based on the medical descriptions of how he would have looked. So before we start, I want to read John 3:14 through 19. Which says, "And as Moses lifted up the bronze snake on a pole in the wilderness, so the Son of Man must be lifted up, so that anyone who believes in him will have eternal life. For God loved the world so much that he gave his one and only Son, so that everyone who believes in him will not perish, but have eternal life. God sent his Son into the world not to judge the world, but to save the world through him. There is no judgment against anyone who believes in him, but anyone who does not believe in him has already been judged for not believing in God's one and only Son. And the judgment is based on this fact: God's light came into the world, and people loved the darkness more than the light, for their actions were evil." This verse highlights everything, the mindset of the people that were going against Jesus. They hated the light because their hearts were evil. So we're going to begin in the garden with a man in distress who has a connection with God. And I'm not talking about Genesis here. I'm talking about Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. So it was a tongue twister. So Paul, in his letters, often refers to Jesus as a second Adam. And there's actually a lot of similarities between Adam and Jesus. We could have a whole sermon on that. But I'm just going to list a few here. The first Adam disobeyed God. The second Adam obeyed him to the bitter end. The first Adam blamed his wife for the sin. The second Adam took the punishment of his wife upon himself. The first Adam fell to sin, death, and the grave. The second had victory over them. The first Adam separated us from the Father, but the second restored us to him. Because we have to remember that he said he could have stopped this at any time. He could have asked the Father to send down 72,000 angels to stop what was about to happen. I've made this point with unbelievers, and they often reply something along the lines of, "So what an angel? Look at the story of Lot. They got beaten up by normal people." But they fail to realize those angels weren't there to bring wrath. They were there to save. These angels that would have came down would have been 72,000 angels trying to protect their king. And just to show exactly what one single angel could do, I wanted to look at 2 Kings. Where it says right here. Says that the angel of the Lord came down to protect the city. So that night the angel of the Lord went out to the Assyrian camp and killed 185,000 Assyrian soldiers in one single night. When the surviving Assyrians woke up the next morning, they found corpses everywhere. Imagine that just for a second. You are trained for your whole life to be this soldier. You are a machine of death, and you wake up the next day and you find the entire army dead all around you. And that was just from one angel. Now imagine 72,000 angels coming down to protect their king from what was about to happen. The kingdom, right then and there. But that was not what he was supposed to do. That was not the plan of God. In the garden, Jesus asked God 3 times to take the cup of wrath away from him if possible. But what's important here is that he submitted to the will of the Father. See, a lot of people don't realize that the garden was surrounded by wilderness. At any point, he could have went back to the apostles, woken them up and said, nope, I'm not doing this, let's go. Wilderness is right there, let's run. He didn't. He stayed there and he waited. All right, so if you want to go to the next. In the book of Luke, it says, being in anguish, he prayed more fervently, and his sweat became like blood. For many centuries, it was believed that was just Christian hyperbole. Somebody can't actually sweat blood. But that was until centuries following, people started sweating blood. It became medically documented as a condition called hematidrosis. This happens when you are under such extreme stress that your blood pressure is so high, the blood vessels around your sweat glands burst, and the blood seeps into the sweat glands and comes out. Doctors often say that this will not have blood and that's it. How many of you here have had a extreme sunburn, like you became red like that feeling would be your entire skin after you sweat blood. The slightest gust of wind would feel like your entire skin is on fire. And that's important because it shows before they even laid a finger on him, he was already suffering. And then as he wakes up the apostles, he says, behold, they're here. You can see the crowd, because this is at nighttime. You would see the torches in the distance as they march toward you. This is, again, nighttime. It would be quiet. You could hear the footsteps. You could hear the rabble. And whenever Judas and the crowd appear, what Judas does highlights that the people that came to arrest Jesus didn't even know Jesus. Judas had to give a signal so that way the crowd knew who Jesus was, which shows that they did not even care enough to have been at one of his teachings. They didn't even care enough to have even seen him along the street. That's how little they thought of him. And Judas, I'm sure many of you here know, betrayed him for 30 pieces of silver. A lot of Christians actually don't understand the significance of that. See, at the time, 30 pieces of silver was the price of a slave. The Pharisees would have known that. Judas would have known that. That shows that the priests viewed Jesus as low as a slave. And Jesus accepted that. He accepted the Messiah. He spent the last 3 years with nothing but just a slave. But you see, even at this moment and going forward, Jesus offers moments of teaching. Because you see, whenever Judas came up to him, what did Jesus do? Did he start cursing out Judas? How dare you go to hell? Boom, instantly down through the earth into hell? No, he said, my friend, do what you've come to do. At that moment, when he was betrayed by one of his apostles, he still called him friend. Now imagine that. Imagine the Son of God that you know is the Son of God. And he calls you friend. Imagine that guilt that you would have in your heart. He probably went into this expecting to be cursed out. He probably went into this expecting Jesus to hate him, but he didn't. He said, my friend, do what you've come to do. And that shows us, like I said, Jesus is teaching us here how we should act towards those who betray us, towards our enemies. It's not to curse them out. It's not to get angry with them. It's to show them mercy and compassion. And he further shows this compassion whenever Peter cuts off the ear of one of the men who came there to arrest him. And Jesus bent down, picked up the ear, and healed it. He healed the man that came to lead him away to his death. I don't know many people out there who would show that level of compassion to people that is about to kill him. And it's also important here because he submits. He does not fight. He submits to the will of the Father. And then finally, the disciples end up fleeing. And that's to fulfill prophecy so that none of them that were given to him by the Father would be lost. But the Gospels do say that Peter did follow from a distance all the way to the house of Caiaphas. And Mark is the only one that adds, I think it's kind of a humorous tidbit. Mark mentions that a young man followed, but was caught by the guards, slipped out of the rope, and now, a lot of scholars say this was actually probably Mark himself, but he just didn't want to admit it. I mean, I'd be pretty embarrassed too. So they bound Jesus and take him away for the nighttime trial. First, a lot of people think they take him to Caiaphas. He was the high priest at the time. He would have been the one to run the trial. They took him to Annas. So, who is Annas? Annas is actually the father-in-law of Caiaphas. He was the former high priest. He technically had no legal power, but the fact that the soldiers brought Jesus there first highlighted how much power Annas still had. A power behind the throne sort of deal. When the soldier struck Jesus, even the Roman soldier said, "Is that how you talk to your high priest?" Now, the Roman soldiers knew exactly who the high priest actually was, but even they saw Annas as the actual high priest. And a lot of biblical scholars actually believe Annas was the one behind the money changers at the temple, so that way he could bring in even more money, even if it meant sullying the temple of God. So Annas would have had a personal vendetta against Jesus at this point. And after Annas, they went to Caiaphas. And after Caiaphas, they would have gone to Pilate, Herod, and then back to Pilate. So at Caiaphas, now this is not at the temple. This would have been against their law because they took him to Caiaphas' home. That was a big no-no to do that kind of business, to have a trial in a home instead of in the courts of the temple. It's also important to notice that some of the Sanhedrin gathered, not all of them. It was only enough for a majority vote. Now, the reason for this is because it was seen as shameful. They're meeting at nighttime. You don't do that with any kind of trials in the Sanhedrin. Yeah? Yep. Yep, they did. It was very sneaky and very illegal with how they did it. Now here at Caiaphas is whenever they are asked, "Are you the Messiah?" And Jesus says, "I am." Now that phrase, the religious leaders known, that's the name of God that he used. And that's why they started shouting out, "Blasphemy, blasphemy." They started spitting on him, mocking him, would have ripped out his beard. And if any guys here have a beard and have had a kid pull on it, it's pretty painful. Now imagine if you grabbed it and actually pulled it out. The skin would be raw. And mind you, at this point, his entire skin would still be suffering from sweating blood. So it would have been heightened pain levels. And eventually they blindfold him and start punching him, saying, "Prophesy to us, who hit you?" They had so little respect for Jesus. Now, I wanted to highlight the Sanhedrin here are breaking a lot of their own laws. They were harping on Jesus constantly for breaking the Sabbath, for breaking this law, for breaking that law. And they're breaking so many of their laws just from this nighttime trial. I'm going to read off a few of the Sanhedrin laws. It says, cases of capital punishment have to be done in daylight. You cannot have cases of such manner at nighttime. The reason is because they viewed having such cases at night as being deceitful, because you're doing it in darkness, and as being sinful, because you don't want to do it in the way everyone can see. If a conviction happens, there must be a second day before any conviction is carried out to require new evidence or witnesses. They didn't do that. Cases would be suspended during festivals, which includes Passover week. They still had the trial despite it being Passover week. They broke that law. Sanhedrin law says no unanimous decisions are allowed, as it shows a lack of mercy or evil hearts. But Scripture says that they all shouted out in unison. You cannot have any false witnesses, but they constantly try bringing forward false witnesses to accuse him. The person on trial cannot self-incriminate themselves, and yet, when they asked, "Are you the Messiah?" and he said, "I am," that's self-incrimination, and they took it as judgment. And finally, you are not allowed to abuse the one on trial, but they still beat him, they still mocked him, and spit on him. All of that to show these people were hypocrites. They believed that the law did not apply to them, but they could force it on everybody else. Constantly, Jesus is saying, "Woe to you hypocrites." And they got so offended because in their hearts they knew. They knew, and it's evident here at this trial, that they actually were hypocrites. It's actually at this trial that Peter denied Jesus 3 times. And after the third, Jesus looked across right at Peter, which caused Peter to break down and weep bitterly. Imagine being Peter in that moment. Up to then, you're constantly saying, "I'm never going to betray you, God. Never would I ever do that." And then as soon as you deny him the 3rd time, Jesus turns across the whole crowd and looks right at you. He knew exactly where Peter was. And at dawn, they waited until daybreak to give their legal ruling. So they had the entire trial at night up to that point, and they waited until dawn so that they could say, no, this whole trial was perfectly legal. See, it's daylight out. The trial happened in just a couple seconds, and we gave the ruling. Totally legal. It wasn't. So then Jesus went to Pilate. Now, Pilate would have been all the way on the other side of Jerusalem at this point. And at this meeting, Jesus is innocent. But to try to pass the buck, so to speak, he heard Jesus was from Galilee. And when he heard that, he's like, "Oh, I'm just going to let Herod take care of it." So he sends him off to Herod. Let him be Herod's problem. And whenever he arrived at Herod, Herod was excited. He's heard so much about Jesus. He wanted to talk to Jesus. And whenever he was asking Jesus questions, Jesus would have just been bound, perfectly silent. Every single question, no response, no reply. And that irritated Herod greatly because he was hoping for a sign. He was hoping for magic tricks. He was hoping for something. Nope. No, perfectly silent. Which then caused Herod to say, "This man's just a madman, but he's innocent. Let Pilate deal with him." So they send him all the way back across Jerusalem to Pilate. Imagine Pilate. Come on, I just sent you over here to get dealt with. Why are you back here? And he ends up saying to the religious leaders, "Herod and myself found this man to be innocent." But that's when the crowds start shouting out, "Crucify! Crucify him!" Pilate couldn't believe what he was hearing. This man is the king of the Jews. Why would you want to kill your king? Because as a Roman, you viewed the Caesar as your king. So he would be so confused why people would willingly sacrifice him. And it was at this moment that his wife sent a message to him saying, saying that she received a dream telling him have nothing to do with Jesus. That is important because in Roman culture, they're polytheistic. They believe that the God messages the dreams. So he would have been thinking about that this whole time. Maybe the God is telling me not to do something. He's innocent, but people still want him dead. Maybe I shouldn't do anything with him. So he instead honors the Passover principle of offering a prisoner to be freed. So he does something that he would have thought is an obvious choice. He offered Barabbas, a known murderer, a rebel, an insurrectionist. There's no way they would choose him over an innocent man. But they do. The religious leaders convinced the crowd, choose Barabbas, shout Barabbas. And they do, which baffles Pilate. These people want this innocent guy to die? He just could not understand why. So thinking that he would satisfy the bloodlust and murderous intent, he says, I'm going to flog Jesus, with the intent to set him free afterwards. He thinks beating him so severely would shock them into sense. Now the flogging, a lot of churches that I've been to sugarcoat this. They often teach it that it was like a bullwhip. It's cracking across the back. It was way worse. It was known as the halfway death because of how bad it was. This was actually one of the favorite methods of torture by Rome. Now the weapon was known as a flagrum. As you can see there, I made a rough replica. So a long handle for reach. The braids would have been a lot longer. I underestimated how much leather to use. But at the tip of every whip would be a lead ball. If you hold lead in your hand, you know how heavy it is, how dense the metal is. And spaced in between would be sharp bits of metal and bone. So what would happen is as they would hit, they would flick their wrist, and the ball were open to exposure. And then you had Josephus, who said he was whipped till his bones were laid bare. This highlights the severity of it, and the skill of these Romans, that they were able to pull out the veins. They were able to pull out skeletal tissue. Now, a medical doctor actually gave a rough equation of what it would have looked like as they pulled out the muscle. He said if you reached into an empty pocket and you pull out the pocket, that would have been the muscle coming out from the back. He termed it ribbons of flesh. And he said as soon as it reached the oxygen, they would have been quivering because muscles that deep are not meant to be open to the air. It would have caused intense pain and intense burning. So the next slide will have medical depiction. So this is depicted as Jesus. The flogging victim would face the post with the arms up high, and they would be stripped naked. Now behind him would have two Roman soldiers who would be specialists at this. These men were chosen specifically for their sadistic thoughts and their manners. They would have loved this. It's actually recorded that soldiers who did floggings would often play games. Who could make the victim cry out first? Who could make him pass out first? Who could cause the most blood? And as you can see, one would stand on one side, one on the other. That way they could have constant hits. So one